Our society is bizarrely struggling to figure out the difference between men and women right now. I'm sure that you have all noticed this. And partly, I suppose, this is because we have done everything that we possibly can over the last 100 years to erase the lines. And we're only going farther and farther down that road as a society. But of course, in the church, we know better than that, right? When we look at the church, we see, for example, male leadership. It's a clear distinction between men and women, and it was designed, it was put into practice by the apostles at the very beginning. Men are the ones who are supposed to lead. Okay, so fine. But another thing that I've noticed over the years is that while we have men who are in leadership roles, I seem to see more women who are working hard in the trenches. And I think that is a lot of just the simple nature of women, that they tend to be more spiritually minded, and that's a result, in part, of just knowing that you're generally not strong enough to manhandle people into submission or things into submission. And I don't think it's really an accident that we don't say woman handle, we say manhandle. And so you can't just think about brute force. You have to think about higher concepts. You have to think about things that aren't physical, that you can't hold in your hand. But often these very women are all too willing to overlook shortcomings spiritually in their men. And then I see a lot of men who are absent. Either they're physically absent or they're spiritually absent, or sometimes both. And men are typically more physically minded on average. And that comes in part from knowing in the back of your mind, even if you almost never act on it, that you could probably force most people, because between women and children, that's most people, and even smaller men than you could probably force them to do a lot of what you want. So even if you don't act on that, just knowing that in the back of your mind, even if you don't really consciously acknowledge it, it makes it easier for us to think in purely physical terms, and think of using our strength to fix problems. And we can often use the duties that come from that physical strength as excuses to fail in our spiritual responsibilities. A lot of people are struggling to figure out what it means to be a woman. And right now, the church, I don't just mean the church here, I mean the church broadly, the church, especially in this country, but really all over the world, needs to consider what it means to be a man. What comes to mind when you hear the term manly? You probably think of physical strength. You might think of aggression, competitiveness, confidence, courage, pride, risk-taking behaviors, dominance, or a desire at least to be dominant, a willingness to do violence, anger. Anger is a whole lot more common in men than it is women. And of course, none of these are exclusive to men, but they're definitely slanted toward the masculine. Appetite. Appetite is another manly thing, and that applies to food, it applies to play, it applies to sex. Those are all manly attributes. Protectiveness. Cold rationality, unfeeling rationality. Are these good things or bad things? The answer is yes. It depends entirely upon how they are directed. There's a lot of modern confusion over masculinity and its role. We can see that most clearly in the whole transgender nonsense that is becoming more and more and more common. And funnily enough, when I first wrote and gave this lesson, gender dysphoria was still almost universally recognized as a mental disorder, something that requires therapy to correct. And that's kind of changing now. Something to be affirmed even though it comes with gigantic suicide rates, even though there's almost always a failure to, well, there's always a failure to truly assimilate into the target gender. And that's not to mention that it's a rebellion against God's moral standard ever since Eden, which was reaffirmed by Jesus, by the way, in Matthew, where he says that from the beginning it was not so, but God created them man and woman, created them male and female. And he said that the man should leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And that's the entire sexual ethic, summed up in like one sentence, in a reference to Genesis 2. So it's a rebellion against that, and the confusion persists. But that's a pretty recent phenomenon. I mean, it's been going on for a while, but having become so mainstream, that's pretty recent. You go back several decades, and we've always been seeing in our lifetimes the desire to tamp down on a lot of the masculine qualities because they are toxic. And you might have heard the term toxic masculinity. Now, in principle, that phrase would refer to the abuse of all those characteristics that I listed a couple of minutes ago. In practice, pretty much anyone who uses the phrase toxic masculinity means that the fact that those characteristics exist is a problem, and they need to be eliminated. And I think we probably all recognize both of those, the transgender stuff and the toxic masculinity stuff, as misguided at best. But with what do we replace them? Let's turn to 2 John and read verse 1. Second John, verse 1. John addresses this letter, the elder himself, to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. The elect lady. This is some lady that this is the church. He's talking to the church. The elect lady and her children. He means the church. So here we are talking about what it means to be a man. Here we are talking about manliness and how we're in a society that's trying to get rid of manliness. But right here, we've just learned that the church is a woman. On top of that, in Ephesians chapter 5, we read about the church as the bride of Christ. In Revelation 19 and 21, the church shows up in the same fashion, as a bride. In John's visions, she's actually embodied in some form as a woman. So the church is a woman. So maybe Christian men should shun the masculine and should take on the more feminine characteristics. No. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Paul's not even talking exclusively to the men in this passage, but he says in 1 Corinthians 13, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." And he's telling the whole church to do this. How can he say that if the masculine qualities themselves are the problem? Well, it's because they're not. It's because we do have roles to fulfill. And men are supposed to be men, and women are supposed to be women. And we're supposed to act like men, and women are supposed to act like women. It seems like that shouldn't be a surprise, and yet it's something that needs to be repeated in this day and age. Let's look at a towering example of masculinity in 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17, and let's read verses 4 through 11. Where's the switch? Now I remember that. Beginning in verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Almost every masculine trait that I listed a little while ago is embodied in Goliath. And the ones that aren't specifically mentioned, we can probably assume are there. This is a manly man. He inspires fear in his opponents. He inspires great confidence in his allies. That is exactly what a man ought to do. And King Saul, who was selected in part because he was a manly man standing head and shoulders above everyone else, is dismayed and greatly afraid. Goliath is very manly, and yet, who was more manly? Was it Goliath or David who defeated him? David actually displayed all of the masculine qualities that I listed as well. Even if to a far lesser extent than Goliath, he was still very manly. But all those things, the masculine characteristics, those really weren't what allowed him to be victorious in the fight, the ones that I've listed. If we go down to verse 26, let's read, let me find it here. Read what David says. "And David said to the men who stood by him, 'What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?'" What does he have at the center of his convictions and his motivations? He's thinking about the reproach to Israel, and he's thinking about the fact that God is being defied and reviled. And he's not going to stand by while that happens. Now, there is some of the selfish in there as well, right? He started out by saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine?" So he's thinking about himself, but he's not just thinking about himself, he's thinking about Israel. And he's not just thinking about himself and Israel, the physical, he's thinking about God, God's expectations. All three of those are coming together to motivate him to stand before this tower of testosterone and say, "Sure, I'll do battle with you, and I'm going to win, because it's not really me who's doing the fighting." We jump down to verse 32. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." He's been there. He's done that. He has actually faced mortal dangers. He's fought bears. Have you ever fought a bear? I don't want to come across a bear in the wild. If I do, then I want to have a gun with me. Here's a guy who went after a bear with a sling and a staff. I don't know, probably a big knife. Maybe you would call him a risk taker. Let's jump down. Let's look at the actual fight, beginning in verse 46. David is again speaking, and he says to Goliath, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So I asked, what was it that allowed David to be victorious over Goliath? They're both manly men. One of them is a lot more manly than the other. David was victorious because he had one more masculine quality that I've been holding out on you. He had a zeal for God. And this zeal for God finds its way into David's application of every one of the other masculine qualities that we have discussed. We're not going to read it because we would be here until midnight, and Eutychus would fall out of the window, and I can't do anything about that. In chapter 17, we've got him fighting Goliath, in spite of his physical shortcomings in comparison to him, and he stands up to put a stop to God's reproach. That's what puts him over the edge and wanting to fight this man. In chapters 18 and 20 and 23, we find him acting in another very masculine fashion. He is extremely loyal in his friendship to Jonathan. And it's not just that he's really good friends with this guy. They get along great. He describes his friendship with Jonathan as a covenant before the Lord. So his spiritual zeal finds its way into his friendships. In chapters 19 through 27 of 1 Samuel, David bravely runs away. He runs away from Saul. Now that doesn't seem like it's particularly manly, but why does he run away? He's standing for his principles. He says on a couple of occasions that he will not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. It's not that he's saying, I'm afraid Saul is going to beat me. Yeah, he knows that's possible, but that's not his main concern. His main concern is, I don't want to be responsible for killing the king that the Lord had anointed. Even though he knows he's been anointed as the new king, he knows that he's going to replace Saul. He doesn't take that as an excuse to lash out and give in to his baser masculine inclinations. He refuses. In chapter 25, in the middle of all that, we see an instance where he comes up against a man who he's a manly man, but in the worst of ways. He's gone to the extreme. He is a drunken lout by the name of Nabal. His name actually means fool, like a very immoral man with no consideration for God's law. And David, rightly, is very irritated at Nabal's attitude. And he also is about to give in to his baser masculine impulses. He's ready to go and slaughter Nabal and his family and take his stuff. But he yields to reason and right when they are presented to him. And he's not being feminine. He's not tamping down on the masculine when he does that. It wasn't an emotional appeal to get him to stop. It was rationality and morality. And because he had a zeal for both of those and a zeal for God, he thanks Abigail for correcting him, and he turns around and goes away. And he leaves it to God. In chapter 30, we find David being invested in other important relationships. His wives have been kidnapped, as well as some other people in a particular city, and he goes to rescue them, putting himself at great risk. But there's one verse that I really want to read in chapter 30, before he has gone to rescue them. Verse 6, and David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He's about to go out, put his own neck at risk, to bring his family back, to rescue these captives at the point of a spear. And what does he do first? He consults with God. He strengthens himself in the Lord his God. Also in chapter 30, we see him being very fair to his subordinates, when it might have been his inclination to, I'm just going to take all this loot for myself. After all, I was the leader. Or to say, well, the guys who fought alongside me, they deserve to get everything, and you guys who stood back with the baggage, I mean, there's no reason that you ought to get anything. You didn't help. These guys did. I want them to be loyal to me, so I'm going to give them a... No, he doesn't do that. He says, well, you guys were part of this too, part of this expedition. I'm going to be fair and distribute the spoils evenly. He's being very rational, and he's kind of going contrary to his own pragmatic interests there if he wants these particular men to be very loyal to him. But he does it because it's right. In 2 Samuel, the story, of course, continues. And we see after Saul has died in chapter 1, when David finds out about this. Saul has died. You would think that would be cause for him to rejoice and say, finally, it happened. I knew it was bound to, and I'm not responsible. Thank the Lord for that. He mourns. He laments Saul's death, even though Saul is a horrible guy who's tried to kill him on numerous occasions and pretty well deserved what he got. But he shows respect to the king and also to his father-in-law, let's remember. He shows respect to Saul, even though Saul doesn't really deserve it. Even though Saul's not even there to receive it or to reward or to punish him based on his behavior anymore. But he does it because it's right. And then finally, this will be our last example from David with his manliness and the zeal for God. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, I'd like to read a chunk of this one, beginning in verse 12. We find David here being very passionate about God. 2 Samuel chapter 6, beginning in verse 12. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal, and David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, and as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. As a side note, despite what Michal says here, it's pretty clear from the rest of the story that he's not naked or anything. He's just dressed in a way that Michal considers to be very undignified, that he's not dressed appropriately for his role in society. How does David respond? Verse 21. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Sometimes people side with Michal on this one. We should not. David was right. He ought to celebrate this. He ought to be rejoicing, and he ought to be willing to be held in contempt, to be abased, as he says, because of his joy at receiving the blessing of God's presence. Others are looking at him and they're thinking, oh man, that guy. And he's saying, I don't care. It's time to celebrate. It's time to rejoice. It's time to be happy because God's throne is where it belongs. It's in my city. God is with us. Praise the Lord. And your impressions of me, they don't matter to me that much. And David himself knows that even though his wife, Michal, despises him over this, That the very people she's so concerned are going to think so poorly of him, these female servants? He says it's going to have the opposite effect. They're actually going to honor him. David wasn't always manly, though. We've looked at how manly he is. He's a wonderful example of masculinity and of the whole picture. But he wasn't always manly. Starting in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, everything with Bathsheba. Now, yes, he gives in to his masculine impulses there, but that's not really what we're talking about when we say manly. We don't mean a slave to your lusts. Now, maybe manly means having an appetite, and he has an appetite. There's no getting around that. That's all fine, but he's being a slave to it. That's not manly. And he acts less and less virtuous. I would love to go on a tangent about the word virtuous, but I don't have time. If you're interested, look up the history of that word, where it comes from later on. As the story continues, David allows his family to splinter and to fight and to sin egregiously without receiving any consequences from him, the head of the household. He commits major sins of his own that run counter to the manly quality of self-control that he had displayed so well in prior years. But he did learn, he did see the mistakes, he did understand the problem. And that brings us back to the passage that Rich read for us at the beginning, in 1 Kings chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. In general, men, particularly in the church, need to be more manly, not less. And we need to focus on the spiritual aspects, not just the physical. Focus on developing spiritual strength, spiritual courage, spiritual confidence. Be willing to take some risks spiritually. Develop leadership. You should have a spiritual appetite. You realize that? Do you have one of those? Develop a spiritual protectiveness. Where appropriate, it's fine to be angry, even over spiritual things. It's even okay to have a willingness to do spiritual violence, to get into a conflict that needs to occur with the knowledge that some harm very well might be done here, rather than to go with the alternative and just avoid the problem and pretend that it will work itself out. It never works itself out. That doesn't mean that we should always be confrontational. As with everything, we need to be moderate. We don't go to the extremes. We don't get belligerent over every little opinion that somebody doesn't agree with. We also don't just let somebody bowl over the Word of God. Be manly. Find that moderate middle ground where you can create a conflict, or I shouldn't say create a conflict, where you can begin a conflict that is already in motion. Deal with it. And don't be turned away by the possibility that somebody's feelings are going to get hurt or that somebody's going to be turned away from the Lord. All of these masculine qualities are complemented and sometimes even require their physical counterparts. When we're talking about a spiritual strength, a spiritual protectiveness, doing our spiritual duty, very often that requires us to have some physical masculinity too. Let me give you a couple of examples. Men, you're supposed to be in charge of your household. Okay? That's a spiritual duty. It's for spiritual reasons that you ought to be in charge of your household. It's going to be a lot easier to be in charge of your household if you have the ability to enforce your will. You ought to be protective of your household spiritually, and you have a spiritual responsibility to be physically protective of your household too. You're going to be a lot more effective if you are able to physically protect your household. Think about David's willingness to fight and kill Goliath. That was for spiritual reasons. But he wasn't a little child. You know, we sing Only a Little Boy David. Compared to Goliath, he was a little boy. But he's like at least a teenager who has experience in killing lions and bears. He had a reasonable expectation that his physical abilities were at least equal to the task. That doesn't mean he's going to win. That doesn't mean that he's not going to get hurt. But he had cultivated a physical strength and courage as well. Our culture has been telling us for a long time now that masculinity is a problem, that it is a bad thing, but it's not, unless it is misapplied and misdirected, which it often is, and that's really the problem. That's why 93% of federal prison inmates in this country are men, and 7% of them are women. Now, either that speaks of a horribly biased justice system against men, or perhaps more likely that men are committing about 13 times as many major crimes, especially violent crimes, as women. Are you going to let anyone tell you that there's no essential difference between the two? But that's what we find with the unchecked, with the immoderate, I suppose would be the word, masculine qualities that are not kept under control, that are lacking the masculine quality of self-control, that are lacking the masculine quality of a zeal for God and a zeal to do what is right. When men take the whole package of what it means to be a man, including those things, self-control, responsibility, reliability, respect for authority, and zeal for God, there are going to be a lot fewer problems with unchecked masculinity or toxic masculinity. And coincidentally, there will also be a far better outlook for the women and children who have every right to expect more and to expect better from their men. So, for the women, I've been talking mostly to and about men here. For the women, support and encourage your men's desires and efforts to carry heavy burdens, both physically and spiritually. Support and encourage their desire and efforts to help those who don't have the same kind of strength, and their efforts to lead, and their efforts to protect, their efforts to provide. And when they fail to fulfill their responsibilities, don't make excuses for them. Don't enable their failures. On top of being very unhelpful to them and leading them down the wrong road spiritually, or encouraging them to go down that road at least, it's going to make your own situation more difficult if you put up with those failures, if you enable them and encourage them. And for the men, follow God's instructions. Follow the examples that we see of real men in the Bible. Learn from the cautionary tales about an abject failure to act like men. And learn to see masculinity, including your own masculinity, as more than physical strength, but also a moral and spiritual strength that keeps the physical under control and guides it and directs it appropriately. As we wrap up, do you know who is the best example of a man's man in the whole Bible? We looked at David because of the contrast with Goliath was just so enlightening. But there is a much, much better one than him. Jesus. Jesus is a man's man. And it might not be what you expected because we think of, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, but that's not the whole picture of Jesus. And there's a lot to unpack there, and we don't have time to get into it. It'd be a good thing for maybe you to study and share with others. It sounds like you've been doing a little bit of that already in your Bible classes. Keep that up. But I want us to think about one aspect. In Ephesians 5, I've referred to this passage already, but I want to read one verse from it as we close. Ephesians chapter 5, Paul says in verse 25, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." There's a lot to unpack there too, but to summarize, he gave himself up for his bride. Is there anything more manly that you can think of than to willingly endure immense pain and the irrevocable tearing apart of your body in order to rescue your bride from a fate worse than death? That's the manliest thing I've ever heard. Don't reject that gift that he has given for his bride. Share it with him. By dying yourself to sin, dying to the world, dying to the flesh, being buried with him, if you still need to do that, and then rising to live as a new person who has been redeemed from sin, who's ready to go about life, living as God intended, as God designed you, as God purposes for you to live, and to be joined forever to Christ. Let's stand and sing.